For someone with a nickname like the Beast, you can tell pretty early on that this guy has a lot of demons working overtime on his case, because he honestly gave evil a new meaning entirely. For real, if there was a hall of infamy for serial killers, Luis Garavito would be in the VIP section, sipping on a cocktail of pure evil. He killed, mutilated, and butchered over 200 little boys, and to date remains one of the world's most evil men. I mean, most serial killers probably got inspiration from this guy's horrific escapades. But the real question is, how does someone become one of history's most prolific murderers? Was he born bad? Did he eat one too many lead paint chips as a kid? Or was his childhood such a train wreck that it derailed him straight into a life of horror? Well, let's find out. So, on one stormy, rainy night, on January 25th, 1957, in Genova, Quindío, Colombia, the cries of a little baby boy would be heard in the house of Manuel Antonio Garavito and Rosa Delia Garavito. They had just welcomed the birth of their first child, Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos. Born into this small town that, in retrospect, probably wishes they could erase that day from the history books, Luis would go on to be the eldest of 7 children. Unfortunately for these kids, they were born into a household where the word dysfunctional doesn't even begin to describe the living nightmare. The father, Manuel Antonio Garavito, was a violent alcoholic who treated parenthood like a professional wrestling match, only his kids never had a chance to tap out. Beatings were a daily occurrence, and poor little Luis seemed to be his father's favorite punching bag. One time, his father tied him to a chair and beat him with a tree branch for over 7 hours, all because he tried to defend his mother. If trauma had a frequent flyer program, this little boy would have been a platinum member before his 10th birthday. Meanwhile, his mother was largely absent, overwhelmed by poverty and abuse she suffered from their father, her husband. So the young Garavito grew up in a home that was more war zone than warm embrace. Love? Never heard of it. Security? Nope. Emotional support? Not in this lifetime. The only thing consistent in his life was pain, and that was served up daily, like a cursed breakfast special. Now, if Garavito's home life was a horror show, school was not any better. I mean, anyone who was once a teenager would know that teenagers are probably the cruelest humans. In fact, surviving high school was one of the most stressful things you could go through. However, for Garavito, he didn't just get teased. He was systematically humiliated, physically beaten, and mentally destroyed every single day. Sadly, he was small, weak, and sickly looking, the perfect victim. He was also socially awkward and shy and struggled academically. So if someone needed to vent their frustrations, Garavito was there to be shoved, slapped, or mocked. If they were bored, they found new ways to humiliate him. He was pushed into puddles on rainy days and forced to walk around soaking wet. Sometimes he'd even get pinned down while other students spat on him. Other times he'd be forced to fetch food, do homework, or clean up after others. Then, as if being physically tormented at school and home wasn't enough, Garavito was repeatedly sexually abused between the ages of 12 and 14. The first abuse started when a friend of his father's, a local drugstore owner, would entice Luis with gifts, but the minute the boy came closer, he'd pin him down, rape him, and torture him extensively, burning him with candles, violently biting him, and even cutting him with razors. Shortly after this abuse began, Luis ran away from home, and even then, he was still targeted and molested by strangers. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern and cycle of victimization that never stopped. It's as if life handed him a guidebook on cruelty and said, "Study up, kid." And boy, did he study. Eventually, at some point, his mind could only handle so much pain before it started searching for an escape, and for the young 16-year-old, that escape came in a bottle. Luis would drink regularly in an effort to drown or numb the pain of both his past and present, and as his drinking got worse, so did his rage and self-loathing. And it was at this point that fantasies of power and dominance started creeping into his mind. According to psychologists, abused children often take one of two paths. Either they grow up determined to be nothing like their abusers, or they become exactly what hurt them. Well, Luis Garavito didn't just take the second path, he sprinted down at full speed with a machete in hand. He started resenting not just his abusers, but the whole world. According to him, if the world had let this happen to him, then the world deserved to suffer. You see, it was obvious his teenage years had left him completely broken. So as an adult, he had no direction, no purpose, only hatred and perverse desires. He'd started to develop an attraction to young boys, which was most likely a twisted remnant of his own abuse. But soon enough, the desire wasn't enough anymore. He needed power, suffering, and pain. At first, he tried to suppress them by visiting sex workers, hoping that sex would calm his violent cravings. Of course, that didn't work. He tried religious repentance, but the church didn't give him the power he wanted, so he sank deeper into alcoholism, but even the strongest liquor couldn't drown his growing thirst. And in 1992, Garavito finally snapped. He committed his first murder, and that first kill was the only moment in his life that he felt true power. So of course, there was no going back. From 1992 to 1999, Garavito went on a killing spree that would make even the most hardened criminals shudder. He would dress up as a priest, farmer, charity worker, or even a teacher, and would pretend to offer help and food to the poor, vulnerable boys between the ages of 6 and 16 who kinda reminded him of himself. And the poor innocent boys, who were already weak, powerless, and desperate for attention, would willingly follow this deranged killer on long walks into remote areas where Garavito was sure no one would hear them scream. Once alone, he revealed his true self as the monster beneath the mask, and he'd tie them up, torture and cut them mercilessly with knives, broken bottles, or even hurt them with his bare hands. He'd also start violently biting them before the sexual assault, brutal attacks that nobody should have to experience. Garavito had become the beast. Many of this man's victims were found decapitated, dismembered, or left in bloody, horrifying conditions. Some of the bodies were found with their genitals cut off and bones broken at odd angles. It was obvious that this guy didn't just want to kill, he wanted them helpless and weak as he had been his entire life. And when he was done, he'd leave their broken, disfigured bodies in remote fields or forests, sometimes covering them up with leaves, then go out and start hunting again, rinse and repeat. When he wasn't doing this, he'd spend the rest of his time drinking and doing meaningless jobs to earn some cash. There was no purpose to his life. The man lived to kill. Now, if it looked like his face was becoming too familiar in a certain place, he'd just skip over to the next town and begin the cycle all over again. Remember, this was the 90s. This guy was averaging at least one kill every 2 days for 7 freaking years across Colombia. Now, you're probably wondering how this sort of madness managed to remain unnoticed for such a long time. But you have to remember that at the time, Colombia was a country on the brink of chaos and crime. The town was full of gangs and organ traffickers, so even though bodies were being discovered, police just thought it was some organ trafficking ring or ritualized killings. Because this was happening in different towns, different cities, and different states, they didn't even think that in their wildest dreams it could be just one man committing these kinds of atrocities. But as the bodies kept piling up, many of them with similar injuries, torture marks, strangulation wounds, and missing genitalia, the police finally started to connect the dots. One of the biggest breaks in the case that actually caused worldwide panic was when the Colombian police force found a mass grave of children's bones, buried in a place known as Naquederos, in November of 1998. And as if that wasn't enough to shock the community, they found another mass grave of 34 children's bones in the next state. It was at this point that they knew they had a serial child murderer on the loose. However, luck soon shone on the side of justice when some investigators discovered a pair of eyeglasses, a bottle of cheap brandy, and a receipt from a nearby store near one of the bodies. Turns out the man they were looking for so desperately was getting sloppy. He knew they were onto him, and he was panicking. When forensics analyzed the glasses, they found out they were really strong prescription lenses, which meant the owner had severe vision problems, which only affected men between the ages of 39 and 55. And this helped to really narrow down their suspect pool. But even then, they had no idea who he was or where he would strike next. But the most insane thing about this man was that he couldn't even stop. The killings had become an addiction. So, on a sunny day in 1999, Garavito finally made a mistake that put the target directly on his back. He abducted a boy in the city of Villavicencio, and this time, somebody saw him. The boy, Ivan Sagal, was a 13-year-old street kid who was going around selling lottery tickets. But on this particular day, when Ivan didn't come home at the usual time, his worried mother went straight to the police station to report her son missing. Luckily, the investigator she met was a prosecutor who was coincidentally already investigating the murder of 13 young boys on the outskirts of the city for the last 6 months. Murders we already know were committed by the beast. The prosecutor immediately entered the city with a picture of the missing young boy, asking people if they had seen anything suspicious. And as luck would have it, the homeless man who saw Garavito lead the young boy away immediately told the police what he'd seen. He also provided them with pretty good descriptions of what Garavito looked like. The police and investigators immediately dispatched units to search the area, but unfortunately, Ivan's body was found the next day, tied up, mutilated, and murdered in the same horrific fashion as the other victims. But then, on April 22, 1999, police arrested Luis Garavito in another town for an entirely different case. He was caught attempting to rape a young boy, but this time, someone saw him in the act and called the police. At first, they actually had no idea who they had just caught, but when they searched his belongings, they found torn children's clothing, a notebook detailing names and locations of victims, and even photos of young boys. That was the smoking gun. When the police confronted him, the man simply broke down and started spilling his guts. He admitted to murdering over 193 boys. But as authorities continued to investigate, they came to realize a horrifying truth. The number was way above 193 and is believed to have hit almost 300 young boys. He gave gruesome details that only the killer would know and led police to mass graves they hadn't even discovered yet. The guy wasn't just a murderer, but a serial killer on an apocalyptic scale, and he had finally been caged. Now, given to the sheer scale of his crimes, you'd expect the Colombian government would sentence Garavito to the harshest punishment possible, right? But weirdly, that wasn't the case, because Colombian law had a maximum sentence of just 40 years at the time. So, even with all his charges, Garavito got just 22 years in prison. 22 years, a shockingly light sentence for a man who possibly killed hundreds of children. To make matters worse, because he cooperated and led police to more bodies, his sentence was further reduced. There were fears that this monster could be released as early as 2023. Thankfully, the public was outraged, and rightfully so. How come he gets only 22 years after the horrors he's committed? This protest and international outrage forced Colombian authorities to keep him locked up and extend his sentence to 60 years. But the fact that he was ever considered for release at all is seriously horrifying. And then, on the 12th of October 2023, at the age of 66, Luis the Beast Garavito died at a hospital in Valledupar, and the world breathed a sigh of relief.